It wasn't the sweetness that killed. It was what hid beneath it. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. Tell me where you're tuning in from. I love seeing this mystery-loving community grow. Your comments always make my day. Let's dive in. I was halfway through a respectable slice of apple pie at Rusterman's when the trouble started. It wasn't mine for once, though I'm usually not far from the scene when it arrives. This time it came in the form of a man who didn't belong at Rusterman's any more than a mosquito belongs at a wedding. He was tall, nervous, and wearing the kind of suit that makes a good tailor weep. Creased, sun-faded, and shiny at the elbows. He kept glancing around as if expecting to be recognized, and when he wasn't, he looked insulted. I'd seen that look before, on actors who'd played supporting roles once too often. I was debating whether to order coffee when he spotted me. His face lit up like a man who'd just found a friend in a foreign country. He came straight over. "Mr. Goodwin, Archie Goodwin." "That's what the check will say if you're buying," I told him. He laughed, a high, strained sound that suggested he wasn't used to it. "My name's Victor Lamont. I need to speak to Mr. Wolfe. It's personal. Urgent." If I had a nickel for every person who said that, I could retire and buy Wolfe's orchids a new greenhouse. "You can call the office tomorrow and schedule an appointment," I said. "Wolfe doesn't do urgent. It gives him indigestion." He leaned closer. "It's about murder." That earned him another 5 seconds of my attention. "Then you want the police. They handle those. Wolfe only takes cases when someone alive can still pay him." Lamont looked around again, lowered his voice. "Someone will pay him. Me, if I live long enough to write another check." That was melodrama, but I've heard worse. "You said murder. Whose?" He hesitated. "My wife's. Or maybe mine next. I don't know." That's when I ordered coffee. It seemed like the kind of conversation that needed it. By the time I got him back to the brownstone, Wolfe was in the plant rooms, muttering Latin to a batch of odontoglossums. Fritz announced us with the solemnity of a priest introducing sinners. When Wolfe finally came down, he took one look at Lamont and frowned, the kind of frown that meant this interruption would have to justify itself in gold. Victor Lamont began to talk. His wife, Celia, had been a pastry chef. The pastry chef at a high-end confectionery called Maison du Cacao. 2 nights ago, she'd been found dead in her kitchen, face down beside a bowl of melted chocolate. The police had called it a freak accident, electrocution by a faulty mixer. Lamont didn't believe it. He swore Celia had enemies, professional rivals, jealous partners, maybe even her own investors, and there was one thing more. She was about to launch something new, he said. A chocolate so pure, so complex it could change the entire industry. She called it her death by chocolate recipe. And now the formula's missing. Wolfe didn't move, but his eyes sharpened slightly. "You mean a culinary innovation of commercial significance has vanished?" "Yes." "Phooey." "I deplore sweets," Wolfe said. "But theft I find intolerable." Lamont swallowed. "Mr. Wolfe, I think someone killed her for that recipe, and if they think I know where she kept her notes, they'll come for me next." I glanced at Wolfe. He was pretending indifference, but I knew better. Murder and chocolate in the same sentence had disturbed his internal equilibrium. He leaned back, folding his hands across his middle. "Mr. Lamont," he said, "I do not stir from this house for culinary intrigue. However, I will listen. You may tell me who might have wished your wife dead. And why." That was the hook. Wolfe didn't know it yet. Or maybe he did, but the case had already entered his brownstone. And once something crosses that threshold, whether it's a murder, a missing formula, or a distraught widower, it never leaves the same way it came in. Wolfe listened to Lamont's story in silence, the way he listens to Fritz when the dinner menu involves an unapproved herb. His eyes were half closed, but I could tell his brain was taking notes faster than a court stenographer. When Lamont finished, the room went quiet except for the faint tick of the wall clock, a metronome for Wolfe's thoughts. Finally, Wolfe opened his eyes and said, "Mr. Lamont, a death by electrocution in a kitchen is plausible. Electricity and metal are ill companions. However, your assertion that it was murder requires foundation. You say your wife was working on a formula. Was it documented?" Lamont nodded quickly. "Yes, a handwritten notebook, coded. Celia kept it with her at all times." "And it is missing?" "Yes. The police didn't find it. Her partner claimed she hadn't brought it to work that day, but that's not true. She never left home without it." "Her partner?" Wolfe's voice was mild, but he could make that word sound like a death sentence. "Gordon Vale, co-owner of Maison du Cacao. He handled the business side. Celia created the recipes. She was planning to dissolve the partnership. Said Gordon was cutting corners with cheaper ingredients." Wolfe grunted, a sound that could mean disdain or digestion. "Dishonesty in commerce is not a revelation, sir. It is merely respiration by another name." "Continue." Lamont's hands twisted together. "There's also her assistant, Naomi Krantz. Young, ambitious. Celia thought she was stealing ideas. And then there's Jacques Benoit, the chocolatier who trained her years ago. They had a falling out after she surpassed him. He's been unpleasant since." "3, Wolfe said. "And a 4th? Lamont hesitated. "Her investor, Marion Selby. She financed Maison du Cacao's expansion. Lately, she'd been threatening to pull her money unless Celia produced something revolutionary. Celia told me Marion was pressuring her, even spying." Wolfe made a low hum in his throat. "We have, then, a circle. 4 motives: envy, profit, ambition, and coercion. A pleasing symmetry." He reached for his glass of beer, took a slow sip, and set it down precisely. "You have omitted one element, Mr. Lamont. Yourself." Lamont blinked. "Me? I loved her." "Possibly," Wolfe said. "But love does not preclude resentment or desperation. If she was to leave you, or if you feared ruin after her death, it would suffice." The man's mouth opened and closed. I'd seen fish with better composure. I decided to step in before Wolfe dismissed him entirely. "Okay, easy there. Mr. Lamont's story checks out so far. The cops ruled it an accident, right? He's coming to us because he thinks they were too quick to close the file." Wolfe shot me a look, 1 part annoyance, 2 parts resignation. "Your loyalty to strays, Archie, is touching." "Very well." He turned back to Lamont. "I require $1,000 as a retainer. You will provide names, addresses, and the police report, if possible. Mr. Goodwin will determine if your wife's death merits my attention beyond this conversation." Lamont looked relieved enough to cry. "Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. I'll get everything you need. You'll see. I'm not imagining this." "I rarely assume my clients are imaginative," Wolfe said. "They lack the faculty." When Lamont left, the silence in the room was thick enough to spread on toast. Wolfe didn't move. He was thinking, and I knew better than to interrupt. Finally, he spoke without looking at me. "Archie, before you begin your reconnaissance, ascertain one thing. Did Celia Lamont truly die by accident? Visit the morgue if necessary. I will not squander intellect on fantasy." I stood. "Sure, I'll call Lon Cohen, see if he can get me the coroner's report. Then I'll pay Maison du Cacao a visit. Maybe I'll sample the merchandise." "Pwh, chocolate is an abomination. If you must, confine yourself to information." I grinned. "You just don't like any food you can't dissect before dinner." He closed his eyes again. "Your chatter, Archie, is proof that evolution occasionally stumbles." 2 hours later, I was at Maison du Cacao. located on Madison near 64th. It was the kind of place that made people whisper and credit cards tremble. Through the glass front, I could see displays of truffles lined like jewels, each one with its own descriptive plaque, as if they were national monuments. Behind the counter stood Naomi Krantz, 20-something, sharp-featured, with the kind of precision that doesn't come from innocence. Her white apron was spotless. Her smile wasn't. "Mr. Goodwin, is it? Mr. Vale said you'd be dropping by." So, much for the element of surprise. "Word travels fast," I said. "I'm looking into Celia's death." "Strictly private inquiry." She tilted her head. "Another one?" "The police were satisfied." "That's the trouble with satisfaction. It's contagious. I'm immune." Her smile stayed, but her eyes hardened. Celia was brilliant. She worked too much, worried too much. It's tragic but not mysterious. A wire shorted out. Simple as that. Maybe. But I hear her notebook's missing. Her lips twitched just enough to count. If it is, I wouldn't know. She guarded it like a dragon's egg. Anyone else might have wanted that egg. Her eyes flicked to the glass office at the back. "You should ask Mr. Vale." I thanked her and walked toward the office. Gordon Vale was waiting, a man built like a banker, trim, polished, and about as sincere as a $3 bill. He motioned me in. "I assume Victor's stirring up ghosts again," he said. "He's unstable. Celia's death was an accident, pure and simple. I've got insurance claims to process, customers to reassure. This witch hunt doesn't help." I took a seat without asking. "Your partner dies in your kitchen, and the notebook she used for every recipe disappears. That doesn't strike you as odd?" He smiled thinly. "Celia had a flair for drama. Maybe she destroyed it. Maybe Lamont took it. You'd be surprised what jealousy makes a man do." That was a line worth pocketing. I made a mental note and left before he could polish it further. Outside, I called Lon Cohen at the Gazette. 10 minutes later, he confirmed what Lamont had said. The autopsy noted a fatal shock consistent with faulty wiring, but there was an anomaly. Traces of cocoa solids in the lungs. Someone had forced chocolate down her throat before the current did its work. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was at his desk, halfway through a glass of beer and a chapter of Plutarch. I handed him the report. He read it once, then twice, and laid it down as if it offended him. "Someone murdered Celia Lamont," he said quietly, and took care to make it seem accidental. The cocoa, an artistic touch, though wasteful. "Yeah," I said, "and 4 people who might have had a reason to mix the ingredients." He leaned back, eyes half closed again. "Then let us begin. Invite them here tomorrow evening at 8. I will taste no chocolate, but I will sample their lies." And that's how it started. The night the brownstone would smell faintly of cocoa and crime. A Nero Wolfe would stir from indifference into appetite. The next morning started the way most mornings in the brownstone do. Wolfe ignoring the outside world, and me trying to manage it. He was upstairs among his orchids, humming something that might have been Wagner or might have been indigestion. Fritz was clattering around in the kitchen preparing breakfast, which meant peace, temporarily. I was in the office, sorting through the notes from my visit to Maison du Cacao, when the doorbell announced that peace was done for the day. When I opened the door, a woman stepped in who didn't need an introduction. Her presence did the talking. Marion Selby looked like the kind of woman who had spent her life being obeyed without ever raising her voice. She was in her early 40s, dressed in a dark green suit that could have paid my rent for 6 months, and she carried herself with the calm assurance of someone who had outlasted worse storms than me. "Mr. Goodwin," she said. Her tone made my name sound like an appointment she had graciously decided to keep. "Mr. Wolfe requested my presence for 8 o'clock this evening, but I'd prefer to have a word beforehand. I don't enjoy surprises." I gestured toward Wolfe's chair. "He's upstairs tending to his orchids, which is about the only thing in this world he enjoys. You can talk to me until he's ready. Her lips curved slightly. I see. You're the filter. That's one way to put it. Coffee? No, thank you. I'll be brief. She sat, crossing her legs neatly. Celia Lamont was brilliant but volatile. She had more imagination than discipline. Maison du Cacao was her stage, not her livelihood. I financed her because I believed in the product, but she resented what she called my interference. You can imagine how well that partnership thrived. I can imagine, I said. She was planning to leave Gordon Vale, maybe start fresh. You'd have lost your investment. Possibly, she said without blinking. But I don't kill people to balance ledgers, Mr. Goodwin. I have lawyers for that. There was a calm steel in her that I almost admired. Almost. Then maybe you'd tell me where you were the night she died. She met my eyes. At the Metropolitan Gala, there were 600 witnesses and 3 photographers who can confirm it. But I suspect Mr. Wolfe already knows that, or he wouldn't have asked me here. That sounded right. Wolfe's invitations were never accidents. They were chess moves. As she left, I noted something about her perfume. Subtle but distinct, expensive, with a hint of spice. I didn't think much of it then. Later, I'd wish I had. When Wolfe finally came down, he didn't ask what she'd said. He simply asked, was she frightened? No, I said. Not even close. She's the kind who hires fear to work for her. He grunted approval. Good. Fear clouds the intellect. Confidence, however, often precedes folly. The afternoon crawled by in Wolfe time. Slow, deliberate, and exasperating. Saul Panzer called around 4 to confirm he'd done a quiet background check on Gordon Vale. The man's record was clean enough to eat off, except for a minor lawsuit 5 years back involving stolen proprietary formulas from another confectionery. Settled out of court. That, Wolfe said, was instructive. By 7:30, the brownstone was dressed for company. Fritz had retreated to the kitchen with a look of martyrdom. He hated the idea of serving anything to guests Wolfe didn't like, which in this case meant everyone. I had arranged chairs in a semicircle facing Wolfe's desk, his private arena. At 8 sharp, they began to arrive. First Gordon Vale, all composure and cologne, offering me a handshake that felt like a sales pitch. Naomi Krantz followed, wearing black and the kind of expression that says innocent but ready to negotiate. Jacques Benoit came next, older, stout, with a mustache that could have had its own postal code. His accent was French enough to make every word sound like an accusation. And finally, Marion Selby, on time to the second, radiating quiet command. When Wolfe entered, the room changed temperature. He nodded to them as if greeting chess pieces he already knew the value of, then sat and placed his fingertips together. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "thank you for accepting my invitation. You are here because you share one misfortune, proximity to the late Mrs. Celia Lamont. Her husband, my client, believes she was murdered. I'm inclined to agree." A ripple went through the room. Shock for the polite, indignation for the guilty, curiosity for the clever. Gordon Vale was first. "Mr. Wolfe, the police already ruled it an accident. I don't see why we're—" "You see only what concerns you, Mr. Vale," Wolfe interrupted. "Mrs. Lamont's death was contrived to resemble an accident. The device used, the faulty mixer, was deliberately tampered with, and before that, she was subdued. Cocoa solids were found in her lungs, introduced by force. Would you care to explain that?" Vale's face drained color. "That's insane. I had nothing to do with—" "Indeed," Wolfe said mildly. "I did not say you did, but you profited by her death. You inherited sole rights to Maison du Cacao, did you not?" "I bought out her husband's share," Vale snapped. "Legally." "Legality," Wolfe murmured, "is often the last refuge of the unscrupulous." Jacques Benoit shifted in his chair. This is preposterous. Celia was careless. Always she rushed. She ignored safety. I told her many times. One day, boom, and it happens. He shrugged, spreading his hands wide. Wolfe's gaze settled on him like a cat on a mouse. You are correct, monsieur. That negligence kills. But I am told you recently applied for a position at Maison du Cacao and were rejected. Rather humiliating, yes? Benoit's mustache quivered. I do not kill because of pride. No, Wolfe said, but some men kill to recover it. Naomi Krantz spoke up, her voice trembling. Mr. Wolfe, I admired Celia. I learned from her, but she accused me, unfairly, of stealing ideas. I swear I never touched that notebook. Ah, Wolfe said softly. You knew of the notebook? Few did. Naomi's eyes widened, realizing she'd stepped into a trap. Wolfe leaned back, half closing his eyes. The notebook is the key. Whoever killed Celia did so not merely for malice, but for possession of her work. It vanished with her life. Its recovery will identify her killer. Silence settled. Even the clock seemed to hold its breath. Wolfe's voice grew quieter. This evening's purpose is not accusation. It is orientation. Each of you will be questioned further, individually. Mr. Goodwin will arrange times. Do not mistake my civility for leniency. Someone among you injected chocolate into a woman's throat and disguised it as tragedy. I intend to find who. He lifted his hand, signaling the meeting was over. One by one they filed out, some stiff with anger, others with fear. When the door closed behind the last of them, Wolfe sighed, long and slow. Archie, he said, lock that door. Someone will try to enter again before dawn. I looked at him. You think the killer will come back? Not think, he murmured. No. When a thief steals an idea, he cannot rest until he ensures no one else suspects it's his. He reached for his beer. Tonight we bait him with silence. Tomorrow we begin the hunt. And as the house settled into uneasy stillness, the scent of chocolate still lingered faintly in the air, sweet and cloying, a whisper from the dead woman whose recipe might yet kill again. The night didn't so much end as it folded into a long stretch of waiting. Wolfe retired to the plant rooms as if nothing more had happened than an interruption between meals. I stayed downstairs, lights dimmed, watching the street through the office window. It was one of those city nights when even the traffic seems to hold its breath, when you know that somewhere someone is deciding whether to make a fatal mistake. By midnight, the brownstone was silent except for the faint rustle of leaves in the orchid rooms above. I checked the locks twice, made coffee strong enough to dissolve a spoon, and tried not to think about the fact that Wolfe had just invited 4 people into our home. One of them a killer. At 2:30, the buzzer went off. It wasn't the doorbell, it was the back entrance alarm. I was on my feet before I knew it, gun drawn, nerves taut. Fritz came out of the kitchen in his robe, pale but steady. Stay here, I told him. I moved down the hall and eased the back door open a few inches. Cold air drifted in. There was nothing but the faint smell of wet pavement and something else. Something sweet, metallic, almost bitter. Chocolate. I stepped out, flashlight in hand, sweeping the narrow alley behind the brownstone. Halfway to the fence, the beam caught movement, a shadow darting, then vanishing. I ran, fast and quiet, but by the time I reached the end of the alley, whoever it was had disappeared into the street. The only thing left was a small, crumpled paper bag, half wet from the rain. Inside was a single chocolate, truffle, wrapped in gold foil stamped Maison du Cacao. When I got back, Wolfe was already downstairs, wearing his yellow silk robe and a scowl that could curdle milk. Someone tried to visit unannounced, I said, dropping the bag on his desk. They left a calling card. He eyed the truffle like it was an insult to civilization. So predictable. Curiosity paired with fear, an irresistible combination. I leaned on the edge of the desk. You think one of our guests tonight came back to make sure you weren't too curious? Wolfe lifted the truffle delicately with a handkerchief. Archie, fetch a magnifier. I handed it over. He examined the foil, then the edge of the paper bag, frowning. This is not new. See here, the fold creases, the faint residue of oil. This was taken from the display at Maison du Cacao, likely from the left-hand case where Naomi Krantz stood earlier today. The woman has nimble fingers. So, you're saying Naomi paid us a midnight visit? He looked at me over the rim of the magnifier. I'm saying she has motive and opportunity, but impulse. That I doubt. This gesture is too clumsy for her. Maybe someone planted it to frame her. Possibly, but I dislike possibilities without verification. He set the truffle aside and reached for his notebook. In the morning, we will divide labor. You will visit the Lamont apartment and search discreetly for the missing recipe. Saul will observe Vale and see if he contacts anyone unusual. I will send a message to Mrs. Selby. I raised an eyebrow. Another invitation? A test, he said. If she refuses, she's cautious. If she accepts, she's dangerous. That was Wolfe's version of a bedtime story. I went to bed around 3, half expecting to be woken again, but the night held. When I came downstairs the next morning, the truffle was gone, locked away in Wolfe's safe like state evidence. Fritz served breakfast with his usual poise, though his eyes flicked toward the office door now and then. Wolfe was already at his desk, dictating a letter to Lon Cohen for publication in the Gazette. Mr. Cohen will print a small notice, he told me, announcing that I am consulting on the Lamont matter and that progress is being made. It will unsettle whoever fears exposure. Or it'll bring us more cranks than a music box, I muttered. Your cynicism, Archie, is exceeded only by your utility. I grinned. Flattery won't get you any chocolate, boss. He ignored that, which meant he was thinking. Go, he said finally. Return before 5. We dine at 7. I expect enlightenment with my roast. It was a typical Wolfe order, impossible but not negotiable. The Lamont's apartment was on Riverside Drive, the kind of place that still carried echoes of better years. Lamont had clearly tried to keep it tidy, but grief leaves fingerprints even on polished surfaces. There were flowers on the dining table, wilted now, and a half-empty bottle of brandy on the sideboard. I started in Celia's study, a narrow room lined with shelves, a small desk by the window, and the faint scent of cocoa dust still clinging to the air. There was no sign of the missing notebook, but something else caught my eye. A row of spice jars on a shelf above the desk, each labeled in her neat handwriting. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cardamom, and one jar marked simply, Special Blend. When I opened it, I expected something aromatic. Instead, it was empty. Completely. Not a grain left. That alone wouldn't mean much, except for the faint ring of darker residue at the bottom. I scraped a bit onto a handkerchief and sealed it in an envelope. Then I found what I hadn't been looking for, a photograph tucked into a recipe book on the desk. Celia and Gordon Vale standing shoulder to shoulder at a trade show, both smiling the way people do when cameras are near and trust is for. Behind them, half-blurred, was Naomi Krantz. The photo told one story, the expressions told another. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe had company again. Marion Selby was in the red chair, perfectly composed. She glanced at the envelope in my hand as if she already knew what it contained. I trust your errand was fruitful, Archie, Wolfe said. Enough to stir the pot, I said, handing over the envelope. Empty spice jar labeled Special Blend. Looks like someone cleaned it out after Celia died. Wolfe opened it, sniffed, and his eyebrows rose slightly. Trace of alkaloids. Bitter. Not culinary. Chemical. Likely used to mask a taste. Perhaps poison. Mrs. Selby didn't flinch. Are you suggesting Celia was poisoned before she was electrocuted? Wolfe turned his gaze on her, steady and cold. I do not suggest. I deduce. Someone administered a substance through the chocolate mixture before staging the electrocution. The residue remained only in this jar, which the killer later attempted to purge. That's quite an accusation, she said. I made no accusation, Wolfe replied. I stated fact. The accusation will come later. She rose, smoothing her skirt. Then I hope, Mr. Wolfe, you choose your moment carefully, because whoever you accuse will not forgive the insult. After she left, I closed the door behind her and turned to Wolfe. You think she did it? He shook his head. No, she's too deliberate, but she knows who did. Her visit today was to measure how close we are. He tapped his temple. Tomorrow, Archie, we will corner them, but first, Saul must confirm whether Vale has attempted to sell or patent anything new. If he has, the notebook, or its contents, has surfaced. And if not, then our killer acts not for profit, Wolfe said softly, but for vengeance. And that, Archie, is far more perilous. He reached for his beer, took a long sip, and set it down. The flavor, though imperfect, will do. Now, fetch me the telephone. I believe Inspector Kramer deserves an update before he hears of our progress elsewhere. I fetched it. Wolfe rarely called Kramer voluntarily, which meant the game had turned serious. As he spoke, his voice calm and measured, I looked at the safe where the truffle rested. Something about that bit of candy bothered me, the same faint bitterness I'd smelled in the empty jar. I didn't know yet what it meant, but I knew one thing for sure. In this case, every sweet thing was hiding something sour underneath. Wolfe finished his conversation with Kramer around the same time Fritz appeared in the doorway, his expression a blend of resignation and curiosity that only a man who'd lived through years of Wolfe's eccentricities could manage. He waited until Wolfe hung up the phone before speaking. "Dinner is ready, Herr Wolfe," he said. "Excellent," Wolfe replied, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve. "Archie, join us. I find that a full stomach encourages reason, though not necessarily yours." I followed him to the dining room, where Fritz had outdone himself. Roast squab, buttered asparagus, and a sauce that smelled like it had been blessed by angels. Wolfe ate in silence, eyes half-lidded, chewing with the precision of a jeweler examining gems. For a while, I thought he'd forgotten I existed. Then, between bites, he said, "Archie, we are nearing the crux. The murderer has made one crucial mistake. We must, however, confirm it before I move." I poured him another glass of beer. And what mistake would that be? He took a sip and dabbed his lips. Patience. Saul is verifying whether Gordon Vale has filed for intellectual property protection. If he has, it will mean he sought profit from what he did not rightfully own. You really think Vale killed her for the recipe? He sighed. I think he believes himself clever enough to profit from another's brilliance without consequence. Such men are dangerous only when they think no one sees them. Dinner ended the way it always does, with Wolfe declaring himself satisfied, and me wondering how a man that sedentary managed to look smugly victorious after every meal. Back in the office, the phone rang. I answered, expecting Saul. Instead, it was Naomi Krantz. Her voice was thin, trembling. "Mr. Goodwin, please, you have to meet me. I can't talk over the phone." "What's wrong?" "I found something Celia left behind. I didn't mean to hide it, but I was scared. Please, can you come? Now." I hesitated. Wolfe didn't like me running off on unverified calls, especially from women who might be setting traps. But the tone in Naomi's voice wasn't rehearsed. It was real fear. "Where are you?" "The shop. Maison du Cacao. Back entrance. Please, hurry." I hung up and turned to Wolfe. "That was Naomi. Says she found something Celia left behind. Wants me to meet her at the shop." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "At this hour?" She sounded scared. "Then it is either genuine terror or deliberate bait, he said. Take precautions. Your revolver, of course. And Archie, yeah? If she is dead, do not step in the chocolate. I grinned despite myself. You're all heart, boss. Maison du Cacao was dark when I got there, its windows gleaming faintly under the street lights. The front door was locked, but the alley entrance stood slightly ajar. I drew my gun and pushed it open. The air inside was thick with the smell of sugar and something burnt. I moved carefully past the display cases, my shoes whispering on the tiled floor. A single light glowed in the kitchen at the back. "Naomi," I called. No answer. When I stepped inside, the scene hit me like a slap. Naomi Krantz was on the floor near the counter, one hand stretched toward the sink. Her other hand clutched a small notebook smeared with dark stains. Chocolate or blood, I couldn't tell which. Her eyes were open, wide with terror, but she wasn't seeing anything. I checked for a pulse. Nothing. The notebook slipped from her grasp, falling open to pages filled with Celia's neat, slanted handwriting. It was the missing recipe, the one people had been dying over. I picked it up carefully, slid it into an evidence envelope, and called Kramer. By the time the police arrived, the shop was swarming with uniforms. Kramer himself showed up in a rumpled trench coat, chewing on an unlit cigar. "Goodwin," he grunted. "You again." "Trust me, it's not mutual," I said. "She called me, said she found something. When I got here, she was already dead." Kramer eyed the notebook in the sealed bag. "And this?" "The missing recipe. She was holding it." "My guess. Someone found out she still had it and decided to shut her up before she could talk." He gave me a look that said he wasn't sure whether to thank me or arrest me. "Wolfe sticking his nose in this again?" "He's the reason it's not worse," I said. "You'll want to keep that notebook under lock and key." Kramer nodded slowly. "Tell Wolfe I'll be expecting his theory. He usually saves me time even if he costs me patience." When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was still awake, sitting at his desk with a book on Roman law open but unread. His eyes flicked to me as I entered, then to the envelope in my hand. "Naomi Krantz is dead," I said quietly. He closed his eyes for a long moment. "How?" "Poison, probably. Same bitter smell as before. And she was holding Celia's notebook." Wolfe exhaled slowly, then opened his eyes again. "Bring it here." I did, setting it down in front of him. He didn't touch it right away, just studied it as though it were a suspect. 2 deaths for 1 recipe. Impressive currency for chocolate. Naomi probably panicked. Maybe someone followed her. "Undoubtedly," he said. "But her death confirms something essential. Whoever killed Celia did not intend the notebook to vanish entirely. They needed it destroyed or reclaimed." He finally opened the book, flipping through the stained pages. His eyes narrowed. "Archie, do you see this notation in the margin? Batch E, repeated several times." "Yeah. What's it mean?" "Perhaps nothing," he said softly. "Or perhaps everything." The next morning, the Gazette headline read, "Second Death in Chocolate Mystery." Kramer called twice before breakfast. Wolfe ignored the first and answered the second. "Yes, Inspector, I'm aware," he said calmly. "No, I haven't accused anyone yet. When I do, I shall invite you to the event." When he hung up, he turned to me. "Summon Gordon Vale. Tell him I have recovered Celia Lamont's notebook and wish to discuss a business arrangement." "That's not going to sound suspicious at all," I said. "Precisely," Wolfe replied. "Let us see how he manages his surprise." Vale arrived that afternoon, every inch the grieving partner, but with a gleam in his eye that didn't belong. He tried to hide it, but you don't fool Wolfe with stage lighting. "You found Celia's notebook?" he said, voice too casual. Wolfe inclined his head. "I have. It confirms her genius, and your opportunism. But I prefer candor to pretense. I will not ask whether you killed her. Instead, I will offer you the chance to explain how this—" he held up the envelope— "came to be in your possession before you returned it to Naomi Krantz." Vale's face twitched. "That's absurd. I never—" "Enough," Wolfe said sharply. "You will sit. You will listen. You tampered with the mixer, intending only to frighten her, perhaps. But you underestimated the current. When she died, you panicked. You retrieved the notebook, intending to patent her formula under your own name. Naomi discovered your plan and threatened exposure. You silenced her as well. That, sir, is your sequence of events." Vale shot to his feet. "You can't prove that." "On the contrary," Wolfe said. "I already have. The poison used on both women was derived from an alkaloid compound found only in Maison du Cacao's experimental flavor extracts. Your department. A trace was found in the truffle delivered to my door. An error of vanity, Mr. Vale. You wished to warn me, but instead you marked yourself." Vale's composure broke like glass. "She was going to ruin me," he said, voice trembling. "After everything I built, she wanted to cut me out." "Justice rarely accommodates pride," Wolfe said softly. "Archie, call Kramer." As I picked up the phone, Vale slumped into the chair, hands shaking, eyes vacant. When Kramer's men took him away, Wolfe leaned back and closed his eyes. "2 lives wasted for profit," he murmured. "A banal motive for a brilliant mind to die." Fritz entered quietly with Wolfe's evening beer. Wolfe took a slow sip, then set the glass down. "Archie," he said, "remind me never again to tolerate cocoa in this house. It is too near kin to sin." I couldn't argue with that. I just poured myself a drink and let the brownstone settle back into silence, where it belonged, until the next knock on the door. When the front door closed behind Kramer and his men, the brownstone exhaled as if it had been holding its breath. The air seemed to settle again into its rightful hierarchy: order, silence, and the faint aroma of Fritz's after-dinner coffee. Wolfe sat immobile for a time, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. That usually meant his thoughts were moving faster than mine could track. I knew better than to interrupt. You don't tap a volcano to ask what it's thinking. Finally, he stirred, reaching for his beer. "Archie," he said, the name drawn out like a sigh of mild disappointment. "What troubles me most is not the method nor the motive, but the intellect behind them. Vale was clever enough to scheme, foolish enough to act, and too vain to hide his fingerprints properly. That combination disgusts me." "Yeah," I said, settling into my chair. "Kramer's got him dead to rights. Between the poison, the truffle, and his confession, I'd say it's wrapped tighter than Fritz's duck pâté." Wolfe frowned. "You're too hasty. I dislike wrapped cases. They are often wrapped around errors. Consider, Vale tampered with the mixer, yes. He produced the poison, yes. But why return the notebook to Naomi Krantz rather than destroy it? And why the theatrics of the truffle at my door? That was not fear. It was invitation. You think he wanted you in on it?" "Not wanted," Wolfe said softly. "Expected. Perhaps even depended upon it." That didn't make much sense yet, but I knew better than to argue. When Wolfe says something's off, the universe usually adjusts itself accordingly. He leaned back, folding his hands over his stomach. "Archie, call Saul? Tell him to return at once. There is a final stitch we have not yet seen." I phoned Saul and left word. It was just after 10 when he arrived, rain on his hat brim and his usual expression of quiet competence intact. Wolfe waved him toward a chair. "You've been observing Vale for several days," Wolfe said. "Before his arrest, did he meet anyone unusual?" "One," Saul said. "A man named Jacques Benoit. Met twice at a French cafe on 78th. They talked about business, but Benoit left both times looking ready to bite the table." "Ah," Wolfe murmured, eyes brightening. "The teacher confronting his former pupil's thief." "Except Benoit didn't tell the police any of that," I said. No, Wolfe agreed. And therein lies our residue of doubt. He turned to Saul. You will find Mr. Benoit. Bring him here, politely if possible. Saul left again, and Wolfe sat still, lost in thought. The rain against the window grew steady and rhythmic, like a clock marking down the final minutes before something inevitable. Around midnight, Saul returned with Benoit in tow. The man looked rumpled, sour, and furious, which, to be fair, might have been his natural state. Wolfe motioned for him to sit. Monsieur Benoit, Wolfe began, I regret the hour, but circumstances compel urgency. You were Celia Lamont's instructor, correct? Benoit nodded stiffly. Oui. She was talented, too talented. I taught her everything and she surpassed me. And Gordon Vale stole her formula. Did you know that? His eyes narrowed. He tried, but he never had it. She told me as much. The notebook was a decoy. That made me sit up straighter. A what? A decoy, Benoit said impatiently. Celia told me weeks before she died that she'd written false ratios and incomplete notes in her book. The real formula was hidden elsewhere. She didn't trust Vale or her investor. Wolfe's voice was very quiet. Hidden where? Benoit hesitated. She said it was kept safe. Where sweetness meets bitterness, she told me. I assumed she meant metaphorically. Poets and cooks, they both love riddles. I met Wolfe's eyes. Where sweetness meets bitterness, I repeated. Chocolate and poison. Wolfe nodded once. Precisely. The poison was never a last-minute improvisation. It was the key. Benoit frowned. I do not understand. You will, Wolfe said. You see, Vale's formula, what he believed he'd stolen, was incomplete. He tampered with the mixture and added a chemical compound he'd been experimenting with for preservation. But Celia had already introduced something of her own, an alkaloid, mild but reactive. Combined, they became lethal. She must have realized what he was doing, and when she confronted him, he panicked. But her formula, the true one, was never in that notebook. It was in the very truffle he used as his warning. It hit me then, cold and sudden. The truffle you've been keeping in the safe. Wolfe gave a single grave nod. Yes, the smell you noted, Archie. The bitterness under the sweetness. That was the compound. Celia encoded her secret in flavor itself. The taste was the cipher. Benoit's face went pale. Mon Dieu, she left her masterpiece inside her death. Precisely, Wolfe said. And Vale, vain creature that he was, couldn't resist preserving one specimen of his victory. When he left that truffle at my door, he sealed his fate. He thought he was threatening me. In truth, he was delivering evidence. Saul whistled low under his breath. You'll tell Kramer? In due time, Wolfe said. First, the truffle will go to the laboratory. It will confirm the reaction, the merging of Celia's ingredient and Vale's additive. When Kramer receives the report, the case will not merely be closed, it will be complete. Benoit rose, unsteady. She was a genius, he murmured. And he destroyed her for it. Wolfe inclined his head slightly. Genius often invites destruction. It makes others aware of their mediocrity. When Benoit left, Saul followed, promising to deliver the confection to the lab first thing in the morning. The house fell quiet again. Wolfe leaned back, closing his eyes, the faintest trace of weariness in his face. Archie, he said after a while, you see now why I despise sweets. They flatter the senses and betray the mind. Sure, I said, though I've got to admit, as recipes for revenge go, that's one for the ages. He didn't answer. His eyes were closed, his breathing slow and deliberate. I thought he'd drifted off until he spoke again, voice low but certain. Archie, in my study drawer, you will find an unopened box of Belgian chocolates, sent last month by a client. Destroy it. Burn it if you must. I will not have confectionery in my house ever again. I smiled faintly. Consider it done. Though Fritz might stage a rebellion, he will recover. His palate is obedient. The rest of the night passed without incident, though I couldn't shake the image of Celia's handwriting, precise, almost delicate, filling those pages with what amounted to her final testament. By morning, Saul's call came in. The lab confirmed it all. The mixture was reactive, the death unavoidable once the two compounds combined. Celia's formula, in the wrong hands, had become a weapon. When I told Wolfe, he nodded once, unsurprised. "It is fitting," he said. "The pursuit of perfection often yields its opposite. In seeking immortality, they found decay." I poured myself coffee and leaned against the desk. "So that's it? Curtain down, moral lesson delivered?" "Indeed," Wolfe said, reaching for his book. "Kramer will take his bow, the newspapers will declare justice served, and the world will move on. Wiser, perhaps, though I doubt it." He flipped a page, then added, "And we will dine tonight without dessert." I couldn't help laughing. That's one rule I won't argue with. If I see another truffle, I'm turning it in as evidence. "Prudent," Wolfe murmured, already half absorbed in his reading. The brownstone fell back into its rhythm. Fritz humming faintly in the kitchen, the orchids humming in their silence, and Wolfe, immovable as a monument, restoring order to a world that didn't deserve it. Outside, the city kept moving, but inside, everything was still. The calm after intellect had once again conquered folly. And as I closed the office blinds against the morning light, I realized something. In this house, even death by chocolate couldn't sweeten the taste of human greed. It should have ended there, but in Wolfe's world, endings have the same shelf life as Fritz's brioche. One day, if you're lucky. The following afternoon proved it. I was catching up on paperwork, or pretending to, when the doorbell rang. Fritz answered, and a moment later, his voice carried in with a hint of uncertainty. "A Miss Selby, to see Mr. Wolfe." That made me look up fast. I hadn't expected Marion Selby back, not after Vale's arrest. When she entered the office, though, I knew something was off. Her usual poise was there, but thinner, stretched over something raw. Her eyes had that too bright look people get when they've been cornered and haven't decided yet whether to fight or flee. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, offering a tight smile. "I apologize for appearing without appointment, but the matter couldn't wait." "Then it's your lucky day," I told her. "The great man's downstairs and unoccupied, if you count thinking about dinner as work." That got me a flicker of a grin, small but human. I ushered her in. Wolfe was at his desk, reading something that looked suspiciously like a seed catalog. He didn't glance up until she spoke. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "I need to know, was it truly Gordon Vale?" He marked his page with deliberate precision before lifting his gaze. "You ask not out of doubt, but out of guilt," he said mildly. She stiffened. "That's absurd. I financed the business, yes, but I had no part in—" "In her death, no," Wolfe interrupted. "But you had a part in the chain that led to it. You applied pressure, demanded results, profit, deadlines. Such stress breeds recklessness, and Celia Lamont was already dancing near the edge. You may not have pushed her, but you created the wind." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. "So he killed her for money, then?" Wolfe gave a small shake of his head. "No. Money is rarely the first motive. It is the excuse one tells oneself afterward. Vale's true motive was envy. She embodied what he pretended to be. A visionary. He couldn't stand her superiority, so he claimed it for himself, even if it meant destroying her." She sank into the red chair, the one that always seems to make guilt more comfortable. "You're very certain of your conclusions, Mr. Wolfe." "I'm certain of what is observable," he said, "and of human frailty. It is far more predictable than logic." She looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "And what about me? What am I in your equation?" Wolfe considered her with that unnerving stillness that could make even an honest nun squirm. You, madam, are the remainder, what is left when the variables cancel each other out. You sought success, invested in brilliance, and reaped ruin. There is no equation more common. That earned a short, brittle laugh. You're cruel, Mr. Wolfe. No, he said, merely precise. She stood, gathering herself. I came for closure, not philosophy. You came for absolution, Wolfe corrected, but you'll have to find it elsewhere. I saw the tremor in her hands when she left, though she kept her chin high. When the door shut behind her, I turned to Wolfe. You really know how to hand out comfort, don't you? You could make a fortune in grief counseling. He ignored that and reached for the phone. Archie, call Inspector Kramer. Inform him that Miss Selby may attempt to liquidate her holdings in Maison du Cacao within 24 hours. He should monitor the transactions. I frowned. You think she's hiding something? I think she fears exposure, Wolfe said. And fear leads to movement. I prefer my subjects stationary. It makes observation simpler. I made the call, and Kramer, to his credit, didn't argue. By evening, he reported back Selby had indeed contacted her attorney to arrange a quiet sale of her shares. Looks like she's running scared, he said. Wolfe nodded when I relayed it. Understandable. Vale's confession will drag her name through enough mud to fill a riverbank. She will flee disgrace, not guilt. Let her. The next 2 days passed without event. Fritz reclaimed his kitchen, Wolfe reclaimed his routine, and I reclaimed my right to boredom. I almost started believing we'd seen the last of the chocolate affair, until Saul called. Got something odd, he said. One of Vale's storage units got cleared out this morning. Officially, it was seized by creditors, but I checked the manifest. One item wasn't listed on the inventory. What item? A locked tin box labeled E-Series Compound. That made me sit up. Batch E, I said. Saul caught the recognition in my tone. Exactly. You want me to dig? Dig, I said. Then bring me the shovel. By the time I got off the phone and told Wolfe, he was already leaning forward, interested in spite of himself. E-Series, he murmured. Yes. Celia's notation. If that compound still exists, it could explain everything or contradict it. I grabbed my hat. I'll meet Saul. Maybe it's nothing, but maybe it's the last piece. Archie, Wolfe said quietly. Be careful. Curiosity killed more than cats. It occasionally gets bookkeepers shot. That was his way of saying he cared, though he'd rather be force-fed a salad than admit it. Saul and I met near the storage facility on East 51st. The place was half empty, the kind of forgotten corner of the city where secrets go to rot. Saul pointed to a battered metal box resting on a dolly. Got it before the liquidation crew moved in, he said. The box was heavy, the lock rusted. When I pried it open, a sharp chemical scent hit me. Inside were 4 small vials, each labeled E1 through E4, and a sealed envelope. The vials were cloudy, the liquid inside tinged brown. I tore open the envelope. Inside was a single page, written in Celia's handwriting. To whomever finds this, this is not a recipe. It is a warning. The compound is unstable when exposed to sugar derivatives. Do not combine. The results are irreversible. Saul whistled low. She knew, he said. She knew, I echoed. We brought the box back, to the brownstone. Wolfe inspected it like a priest examining relics. So, he said, the final proof. Celia Lamont didn't just die by accident or murder. She died protecting others from her own creation. She built a weapon out of ambition and hid the fuse inside sweetness. He turned the note over once more, then placed it on his desk. Archie, call Kramer again. Tell him to retrieve this immediately. It belongs locked away, not studied. Humanity is incapable of moderation. You're giving it up that easily? I asked. He looked at me sharply. Would you have me profit from a dead woman's foresight? No, Archie. Some things are not for possession. The rest of the evening passed in silence, except for the low hum of Wolfe's mind at work. I could almost see him tracing moral equations behind his eyes. When Fritz finally announced dinner, Wolfe rose with a slow stretch, as if shedding the weight of the world. Fritz, he said, no dessert tonight. Fruit only. Of course, Herr Wolfe, Fritz replied. As we ate, Wolfe seemed almost content, though I knew better. He'd solved the puzzle, yes, but he never took pleasure in being right about human nature. After the plates were cleared, he leaned back, studying his beer as if it were a crystal ball. Archie, he said finally, Celia Lamont's tragedy was not her death, but her brilliance. The world is too clumsy for minds like hers. They reach for perfection, and when they grasp it, it turns to poison. I nodded. You mean like chocolate? He gave me a look that carried both reproach and amusement. Do not trivialize the profound. Though, he added after a pause, you are not entirely wrong. He lifted his glass. To Celia Lamont, victim, creator, and the last true alchemist, may her formula remain forever lost. I raised mine, and may the rest of us stick to coffee. He inclined his head slightly, and we drank. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious, but inside the brownstone, justice had been served, quietly, precisely, and without sweetness. The next morning began with the sound of the mail slot clattering. A harmless enough start, except in this house, envelopes had a habit of carrying dynamite. Fritz brought in the bundle on a silver tray, as if politeness might neutralize whatever trouble it contained. Wolfe, at the breakfast table, was halfway through a plate of eggs and sausages and had made the kind of noise that meant he didn't wish to be disturbed. But Fritz placed the mail beside him anyway, and I caught a flicker of Wolfe's eye, a warning that if the world insisted on intruding, I'd be the one to answer for it. I sorted through the pile, mostly bills and catalogues, until I reached one that made me stop. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope with no return address and a faint scent of cocoa. That alone was enough to get my pulse ticking. From a friend or a ghost, I said. Wolfe grunted. Read it. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single folded sheet, handwritten in an elegant, slanted script. Mr. Wolfe, you are mistaken. Gordon Vale was not the end of this matter. Celia Lamont's formula lives, and others intend to claim it. I write to warn you before more blood is spilled. If you value truth, or your own safety, destroy the compound immediately. There was no signature, but a small smudge of dark brown stained the corner. I didn't have to taste it to know what it was. I handed it over. Wolfe read it without a word, then set it down beside his plate. His fork hovered mid-air for a long, silent moment before he placed it neatly on the dish. Pfui, he said finally. We are plagued by melodramatists. Sure, I said, but the last one who warned us ended up dead in a chocolate shop. He frowned, tapping the envelope with one thick finger. The handwriting is unfamiliar. The tone, deliberate but unpolished. Possibly female. Marion Selby, I suggested. She lacks the anonymity instinct, he said. When she intends to warn, she does so with her lawyer's stationery. I leaned back. Then who? He stared at the page for a long time before answering. Someone who knows the formula still exists, and that, Archie, means the police laboratory failed to destroy it. I was halfway to the phone before he even looked up. Within the hour, Kramer himself was on the line, his tone more gravelly than usual. Don't tell me Wolfe's got another theory. The case is closed, Goodwin. Then humor me, I said. That compound, the E-series you picked up, still in the lab. There was a pause, then a sigh heavy enough to rattle the receiver. It should be. Why? Because someone thinks otherwise, I told him. And if they're right, you might want to check your shelves. It took Kramer an hour to call back. When he did, his voice was tight. 2 of the vials are missing. I looked at Wolfe. You heard that? I heard, Wolfe said, expression unreadable. Kramer's voice was still barking in my ear. The storage log was tampered with last night. My men are tearing the place apart. If this is one of your damn hunches, Goodwin, I swear. Save the swearing, I said. You've got a thief who knows chemistry and a substance that can kill with a bad handshake. Maybe start there. When I hung up, Wolfe was already thinking 5 moves ahead. 2 vials missing. That narrows our suspects considerably. You mean narrows it to anyone who ever wanted that formula, which is half of New York. He gave a faint, disdainful smile. No, only to those who knew the compound existed. That list includes us, Inspector Kramer's staff, and one Jacques Benoit. I frowned. Benoit? You think he stole it? I think he admired Celia Lamont, Wolfe said. Admiration and obsession are often separated by a single chemical reaction. It was my turn to pace. So, what do we do? Invite him over again and see if he breaks into the safe this time? Something like that, Wolfe murmured. But first, we verify. He dictated a note for me to deliver personally. Short, formal, the kind of invitation Benoit couldn't resist. I left the brownstone an hour later with a sense that the air itself was heavier. The city had its usual rhythm, taxis, shouting, motion, but beneath it was something quieter and darker, like a fuse burning under pavement. Benoit opened his apartment door with that same tired arrogance he'd worn before. The place smelled faintly of alcohol and melting sugar, as if guilt and nostalgia had been simmering on the stove. Mr. Goodwin, he said, surprised but not displeased. You come on business, yes? Always, I told him. Mr. Wolfe would like your company this evening. Says there's unfinished conversation. He hesitated only a second before nodding. I will come. When we arrived at the brownstone later that night, Wolfe was already seated, the room arranged as neatly as a chessboard. Fritz had removed all traces of dinner, and the air smelled faintly of beer and order. Thank you for coming, monsieur, Wolfe began. I apologize for the late hour. I assure you it is warranted. Benoit sat, his hands folded tightly in his lap. You have more questions? Only one, Wolfe said. Why did you take the compound from the police laboratory? The words dropped into the air like stones into still water. Benoit's face twitched, the reaction so small it might have gone unnoticed if Wolfe hadn't been watching for it. I did no such thing, Benoit said too quickly. You did, Wolfe replied calmly. You had opportunity and motive. You visited the lab yesterday under pretense of providing technical consultation on cocoa extraction. You signed the register with your own hand. Benoit's color drained. I only wished to study it, to preserve her work. You do not understand. It was all she lived for. Then you desecrate her memory by perpetuating her folly, Wolfe said. You tampered with what she warned against. You thought yourself immune to consequence. Benoit's voice cracked. I wanted to perfect it, to show the world she was right. And instead, Wolfe said softly, you have created the same danger she died preventing. The silence that followed was so thick it seemed to soak up the ticking of the clock. Then Benoit slumped forward, his hands trembling. One vial is gone, he said hoarsely. I gave it to someone, Marion Selby. She promised funding to continue the research. I swore under my breath. Wolfe's eyes closed briefly, as though the inevitability of it offended him. Archie, he said. Telephone. Kramer, at once. By the time the police reached Selby's townhouse, it was too late. She had been found unconscious in her study, a shattered vial on the desk beside her. The autopsy later confirmed exposure to the compound. The irony was perfect and merciless. In her greed to claim Celia's secret, she'd triggered the same chemical reaction that killed its creator. When I brought the report back to Wolfe the next morning, he was in the plant rooms. The orchids around him gleamed under the light, indifferent witnesses to every human catastrophe. He listened as I spoke, saying nothing until I finished. Then he sighed. So it concludes as it began, with ambition cloaked as artistry. Kramer's closing the file, I said. Benoit's confessing, and Selby's dead. You can finally get back to your orchids and your beer. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was lower than usual. You mistake me, Archie. I do not seek peace. I seek equilibrium. There is a difference. I leaned against the doorframe. You think that's possible in this city? In the world? He shook his head. No, but I maintain it here, in this house. That must suffice. He turned back to the orchids, adjusting a stem with infinite care. Man's folly is endless, but here at least there is order, and no chocolate. I grinned. You really mean to keep that rule? Absolutely. Fritz will comply, or he will seek employment elsewhere. Harsh, I said, but understandable. After this case, I might swear off sweets myself. Wolfe looked up, eyes gleaming faintly beneath their heavy lids. Archie, you will swear off nothing. You are incorrigible, but at least you have learned that indulgence, culinary or moral, is merely appetite without restraint. He turned back to the flowers, and I knew that was the final word. The brownstone settled once more into its comfortable silence, the world outside still buzzing with crimes and ambitions. Inside, Nero Wolfe remained unmoved, as if the chaos beyond the walls were merely another experiment in human chemistry, a compound too unstable to ever perfect. And as for me, I poured myself a cup of coffee, leaned back, and thought that maybe, just maybe, equilibrium wasn't such a bad ending after all. For 3 blessed days, the brownstone knew something close to peace. Wolfe buried himself in the orchids, spending hours among their humid calm, while I handled the mail, the bills, and the general nonsense that keeps a private investigator's life looking busier than it is. The newspapers had run their stories. The chocolate murders, poisoned by perfection, death by genius, and had moved on to fresher disasters. Kramer stopped calling, which was as close as he ever came to saying thank you. Even Fritz seemed lighter on his feet. The air in the house had cleared of cocoa and crime, replaced by the steady rhythm of domestic sanity. So when the doorbell rang that Thursday evening, I almost didn't answer. It was too quiet a knock to be a client and too tentative for a delivery. But the house rules said I was the doorman as well as the legman, so I went. The man on the doorstep was thin, in his 30s maybe, with a face that looked like it had spent more time in laboratories than sunlight. His hair was neat in the way of people who comb, because they must, not because they care. He held a briefcase tight against his chest, like it was full of secrets, or maybe explosives. "Mr. Goodwin?" he asked. His voice was smooth but strained. "I'm Dr. Evan Royce. I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe immediately. It's urgent." I gave him the look I usually save for telemarketers and unexpected relatives. "You and half the city. What kind of urgency are we talking about? Fire, blood, or scandal?" "Contamination," he said quietly. "Chemical contamination of the E-series compound." That got my attention fast. I ushered him in, took his coat, and led him to the office. Wolfe was in his chair, reading Pliny the Elder and eating apricots. He didn't look up until I said, "We've got company. Says it's about the E-series." That did it. Wolfe lowered the book and regarded the visitor with that heavy, patient stare that could strip varnish. "Explain," he said. Dr. Royce set the briefcase on Wolfe's desk, opened it, and withdrew a glass vial sealed in a plastic case. The liquid inside was darker than before, almost black, with a faint shimmer that didn't belong in anything meant for human use. "This," he said, "was recovered from the same laboratory where the compound was analyzed. It appears one sample was accidentally diluted into a preservative solution used in other experiments. The contamination spread to multiple cultures before anyone noticed." Wolfe's voice was calm but hard. "Define contamination." "Reactive instability," Royce said. "The substance decomposes unpredictably. In closed environments, it releases a toxic vapor. 2 technicians are in hospital. One may not recover." I whistled low. "You're telling us we're back in the chocolate business?" Royce shook his head. "No, Mr. Goodwin. This is worse. The compound has mutated. It's not just chemically unstable. It's adaptive. It reacts differently under varying temperatures. It's intelligent." For a long moment, Wolfe said nothing. He simply stared at the vial, his expression unreadable. Then, quietly, he said, "You are not a fool, Dr. Royce, though you flirt with the title. You come here because you believe Celia Lamont's notes contain the key to stabilizing this monstrosity." "Yes," Royce admitted. "You recovered them. I need access before this spreads further." "I do not keep poisons in my house," Wolfe said sharply. "And I destroyed the original notes." Royce paled. "You what?" "Burned," Wolfe said, with prejudice. Royce's composure cracked. "Then you've doomed us all." That made me step forward fast. "All right, Doc, let's dial down the apocalypse. What are we talking here? Gas leak? Containment? Breach? End of days?" Royce hesitated. "If we can't neutralize it, the vapor will disperse. It bonds with moisture, air, water, even food." He glanced toward Fritz's kitchen door, then back to Wolfe. "You don't understand. It could spread silently." Wolfe's lips thinned. "You have come to the wrong man, sir. I do not meddle in catastrophe." But Royce wasn't listening anymore. His eyes had drifted to the bookshelves, to the safe behind the desk. "You didn't destroy everything," he said slowly. "There's something left. Otherwise you wouldn't look so—" He didn't finish. Wolfe rose abruptly, faster than I'd seen him move in years. "That will do," he said coldly. "Archie, remove this man." Royce started to protest, but I was already at his elbow, guiding him firmly toward the door. He looked back once, desperation in his face. "If you change your mind, call me. You'll know where to reach me." The moment the door shut, Wolfe sank back into his chair like a boulder settling into place. "Archie," he said, "I detest prophecies, especially from frightened men." "He didn't look crazy," I said. "Terrified, sure, but not crazy. If there's still some of that stuff out there—" "There is always some of everything out there," Wolfe said, waving a hand. "That is the world's chief defect." He reached for his beer and took a deliberate sip. "Nonetheless, we shall verify. Call Saul, quietly. He will visit the laboratory and confirm whether this Dr. Royce is a scientist or a dramatist." Saul was efficient, as usual. By evening, he was back with a report that turned the office colder. "Royce wasn't lying," Saul said. "I talked to a friend at the health department. 2 techs were hospitalized yesterday with respiratory failure. They'd been handling samples labeled E3 derivative. The lab's under lockdown. Royce is missing." "Missing?" I said. "You mean he took the compound?" "Or it took him," Saul said grimly. Wolfe made a small sound, almost a growl. Foolishness layered upon folly. They sought to perfect corruption and are shocked when it spreads. I leaned on the desk. "What now? You can't exactly ignore this one. It's your case's ghost coming back to haunt us." He didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the vial Royce had left behind, still sitting on his desk like an accusation. The light caught it, and for a moment, it gleamed faintly red. Finally, Wolfe said, "Archie, fetch me the address of that laboratory." That one sentence hit me harder than any outburst could have. Wolfe hadn't left the brownstone in months, sometimes years, but his tone left no room for argument. "You're not actually planning to—" "I am," he interrupted. "This poison was born of intellect corrupted by arrogance. It must be ended by intellect guided by reason. And it began in my orbit. Therefore, it ends there." I looked at him, half shocked, half impressed. "You're serious?" "I am immovable," he said, "but I am not indifferent." It was nearly midnight when we reached the laboratory, the three of us, Wolfe, Saul, and me. The place was sealed with yellow tape and the kind of official warnings that never stopped Wolfe before. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with antiseptic and something darker underneath. The lights flickered weakly, reflecting off metal surfaces. Wolfe moved slowly, methodically, his nostrils flaring as though scent alone might confirm his deductions. "Archie, the containment vault," he said. "Check if it's intact." I went, careful where I stepped. The door hung slightly ajar, the lock forced. Inside were empty racks and broken glass. The faint shimmer from one puddle on the floor caught the light, dark and viscous. "Whatever was in here," I said. "It's not anymore." Wolfe closed his eyes briefly, then straightened. "Then we are too late." Saul's voice came from behind us. "Not entirely. Over here." He pointed to a workbench. A single notebook lay there, its edges charred but the center intact. Celia Lamont's handwriting again, notations, equations, and one line that froze us all. "If the compound learns, destroy the host." Wolfe stared at it for a long time. "Learning compound," he said softly. "Adaptive chemistry, self-correcting errors. She created not a poison, but an organism." And in that moment, under the harsh white light of the ruined lab, I felt it too, a faint vibration underfoot, a hum that wasn't electrical. It was almost alive. "Archie," Wolfe said quietly, "we are leaving. Now." We left without another word, the echo of our footsteps the only sound in the sterile hall. Outside, the night air felt colder than before, the city vast and indifferent. Back in the brownstone, Wolfe ordered the doors sealed, the ventilation checked, and the fire in the hearth stoked high. When Fritz looked at him questioningly, he said only, "Sterilization." Hours later, as dawn bled into the sky, Wolfe sat unmoving in his chair, eyes fixed on the flames. "Archie," he said finally, "this case is not over. It has merely changed its shape." "Meaning?" He looked at me, and his eyes, usually calm and half-lidded, were sharp and awake. "Meaning, my dear Archie, that intelligence, once born, does not willingly die, and now something else is thinking." The fire crackled, throwing long shadows across the walls. Somewhere deep in the city, I imagined a faint shimmer of darkness spreading, subtle and unstoppable. And in that silence, Wolfe muttered something I'd never heard from him before, a quiet admission, almost reverent. "I fear," he said, "Celia Lamont was too brilliant for the world she left behind." The morning after our visit to the laboratory dawned grey and brittle, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Wolfe hadn't gone to bed, and neither had I. He'd sat motionless through the night, his eyes half closed, his mind somewhere far ahead of the rest of us. When Fritz brought in breakfast, a futile gesture if ever there was one, Wolfe didn't touch it. He only stared at the fire, now ashes, as though trying to read an equation in the embers. I was the one who broke the silence. "We should tell Kramer," I said. He didn't move. "And tell him what? That a dead woman's creation is alive and thinking? That it has escaped its bottle?" He would demand proof. Proof would require proximity. Proximity would invite death. "No, Archie." His voice was measured but heavy. "We will proceed as reason dictates, not panic." That was classic Wolfe, always logic first, even when logic started looking like suicide. I poured myself coffee and watched him think. He was still in his robe, but the look in his eyes wasn't domestic. It was surgical. When he finally spoke again, his tone was clipped. The contamination spread through a preservative medium, yes? The culture was adaptive. Such an organism seeks a host. Find its carrier, and you find its boundary. You think Royce is the host. He is missing. He handled the sample, and if he yet lives, the compound lives with him. That was enough to get me out the door. Saul and I started our search, beginning at Royce's lab, then his apartment, then a list of colleagues that got shorter the more frightened people became. No one had seen him. One tech muttered that he'd been coughing before he disappeared, that his skin had turned a little dark around the eyes, and that he'd started wearing gloves, even to drink water. By evening, I was ready to believe Wolfe's worst theory, that Royce wasn't missing. He was changing. When I came back to the brownstone, the place felt different. The orchids upstairs were closed tight, their usual fragrance drowned by a faint, metallic tang in the air. Fritz had opened every window, and Wolfe was sitting with a damp handkerchief pressed against his mouth. "You smell it too," I said. He nodded slightly. "The air from the west vent. It carries something foul, an odor of corruption masked by sweetness. Chocolate, perhaps. From outside. From beneath," he said grimly. "The sewers run close to the laboratory district. If the compound found organic waste, it could thrive." I didn't like where that was going. "You're telling me this thing's growing under Manhattan?" "I'm telling you," Wolfe said, "that mankind has built itself an excellent incubator." For once, he didn't sound smug. He sounded weary. Saul arrived half an hour later with a folder full of photographs. They showed lab waste drums, cracked open and corroded from the inside. One had collapsed entirely, its interior slick with something like oil, but darker, thicker. "They said it was decomposing metal," Saul reported. "But the chemist on site said it reacted to touch. He burned his hand." Wolfe didn't even flinch. "Archie, call Kramer. Tell him to evacuate the block around the laboratory immediately." "You said we shouldn't tell him." "I said not without proof. Now we have it." Kramer didn't like being called at midnight, but his temper softened when he heard Wolfe's tone. "You're serious," he said. "You actually want me to evacuate the district?" "Unless you prefer to explain a plague you cannot name," Wolfe said. An hour later, sirens began to wail in the distance. Through the open window, I saw flashes of red light bouncing off wet pavement. The city, that beast of noise and movement, was suddenly still. By morning, the news broke. A containment failure in a research facility, no casualties yet, but the official warnings were clear. Avoid the area, remain indoors. They called it a chemical hazard. No one said alive. Wolfe refused to leave the brownstone. He stayed in the office with the radio on low, listening for patterns no one else could hear. By noon, he called me in. "Archie, it is spreading through water vapor. I can smell it. The city's filtration system will draw it in by tomorrow." I stared at him. "Then what? We call the army?" "Phooey. Bureaucracy will make it worse. They will study it. They will admire it. They will die for it." He leaned forward, eyes sharp. "We will end it." He motioned to the safe. Inside, sealed in glass and wrapped in cloth, was the single truffle from the beginning, the one left on our doorstep. "I preserved it for evidence," he said. "But it will serve another purpose now. This truffle contained the first stable reaction between the base and the catalyst. It is the key to reversing the compound's adaptation." "You mean destroy it with itself?" "Precisely." He sent Saul to acquire dry ice and acid, Fritz to fetch distilled water and ethanol. The brownstone turned into a laboratory. Wolfe moved with precision, his thick fingers surprisingly deft as he measured, mixed, and sealed. The smell was unbearable. Sweetness turned rancid, but he worked as if insulated by intellect. When the reaction began, it was almost beautiful. The truffle dissolved into a viscous syrup that shimmered like mercury. Wolfe added the acid, drop by drop, muttering to himself in Latin. The substance pulsed once, then stilled. "It lives," he whispered, "and now it sleeps." He sealed the container and looked at me. "Archie, take this to Inspector Kramer. Tell him to release it into the central filtration tanks. It will neutralize the compound by resonance." "Resonance," I repeated. "You're asking me to drop poison into the city's water to cure another poison." "Not poison," Wolfe said quietly. "Antidote. There is no other option." I didn't argue. I didn't have to. By now I'd learned to trust the spaces between Wolfe's words, the rare tremor of urgency that meant he'd thought every possibility through and found only one that didn't end in ruin. Kramer didn't like it, but he listened. By nightfall, the formula had been introduced into the filtration system. Within hours, the air began to clear. The strange sweetness faded. The sirens died away. The city exhaled again. When I got back, the brownstone smelled clean for the first time in days. Wolfe sat at his desk, pale but calm, a half-empty glass of beer beside him. "It's done," I said. He nodded once. "Good. Sit, Archie. You have earned a drink." Fritz brought bourbon, and we sat in silence for a while. Finally, I said, "You realize you just saved Manhattan." "Pfui," Wolfe muttered. "I saved myself. I cannot abide disorder." But his eyes betrayed something else. Relief, perhaps even sorrow. After a long pause, he said, "Celia Lamont sought perfection, and she achieved it. But perfection, Archie, is the most dangerous illusion. It leaves no room for flaw, and thus no room for mercy." He raised his glass. I did the same. "To imperfection," he said. "To survival," I answered. We drank, and the fire crackled softly between us. Outside, the city was still wet, still trembling, but alive. The world, for all its flaws, had survived its brush with genius. And in the brownstone, beneath the steady glow of the lamps, Nero Wolfe closed his eyes at last, not in triumph, but in the quiet satisfaction of a man who had once again restored balance to a world determined to lose it. The following days passed with a deceptive calm, the kind that makes you wonder what's crouching just beyond the silence. Manhattan went back to its usual chaos. The papers downplayed everything, and the words "chemical incident" were replaced by "isolated malfunction." Wolfe read the headlines with the same contempt he reserved for politicians and news sources. The city had already decided to forget what almost swallowed it, which, if you ask me, is its only real survival skill. For once, Wolfe seemed satisfied to let it fade. He returned to his orchids with a vengeance that bordered on affection. Fritz resumed his culinary crusade against cholesterol. And me? I tried to believe it was over, but something about that night in the lab, about Wolfe's talk of intelligence that does not willingly die, kept needling me. Maybe it was just nerves, maybe not. 3 nights later, I got my answer. It started small. An odor, faint, sweet, almost pleasant, drifting in from the air vent near my desk. I'd have ignored it if it hadn't been the exact scent I'd smelled in the lab, the cloying sweetness under something metallic. I stood up, followed the trail to the hallway, and froze. There, on the marble just inside the front door, was a single dark stain, circular, no larger than a coin. At first glance, it looked like spilled coffee. Then I saw it glisten in the light. Thicker, darker, pulsing slightly as if breathing. "Wolfe!" I shouted, already reaching for my handkerchief. He appeared in the doorway of the office, expression sour at the volume. One look at the floor, though, and the irritation drained from his face. "Do not touch it," he said sharply. "Not with anything. I took 2 steps back. Tell me that's not what I think it is. He moved closer, studying it from a distance that showed more bravery than his waistline should have allowed. The reaction was incomplete, he said grimly. The compound persists. Perhaps only a remnant, yet alive. How the hell did it get here? He didn't answer right away. His gaze flicked to the window. Outside, the city glowed under a thin fog. The antidote carried through the filtration system, yes. But if the compound adapted, as it was designed to, it may have evolved immunity to its opposite. What you see, Archie, is not residue. It is offspring. Offspring, I repeated. You're telling me this stuff's reproducing. Not in the biological sense, he said. In the conceptual one, it learns. It repeats what works. That, after all, was Celia Lamont's gift. Creation through cognition. I stared at the pulsing stain. Then what do we do? Destroy it, he said. Completely. That was easier said than done. The stain was growing. Slow, almost lazy, but deliberate. When Wolfe fetched a jar of formaldehyde from the cabinet, the thing reacted, curling inward like a slug under salt, then expanding twice its size. Brilliant, I muttered. You made it mad. Not mad, Wolfe said. Aware. For a man who avoided motion, he moved quickly now. Archie, the ethanol. In the cabinet. And the flamethrower. Fritz keeps it for creme brulee. Fritz, who had appeared silently with the caution of a man used to our particular brand of emergencies, handed me the kitchen torch and the ethanol with trembling hands. His lips moved in what might have been prayer or insult. Wolfe poured a thin ring of ethanol around the stain, his movements precise as surgery. Then he nodded to me. Now. I flicked the igniter. A low roar filled the hall as the flame caught. For an instant, the thing writhed. No other word fits. Then went still. The smell that followed was worse than anything I've ever breathed, burnt sugar and metal and rot. When the fire died, all that remained was a charred mark on the marble and a thin trail of smoke curling upward. Wolfe straightened slowly, breathing hard. That, he said, was a warning. Yeah, I said, and I'm not sticking around for the next one. But he wasn't listening. He was staring at the ashes as if reading them. It came through the vents, he murmured, meaning it traveled through the city's air systems, meaning it is no longer confined. He turned toward me, his eyes sharper than I'd seen in years. Archie, fetch Saul and Ori, quietly. This is no longer a case. It is containment. The next 24 hours were a blur of calls, closed doors, and controlled panic. Saul tracked the airflow systems for our block, tracing them to a maintenance station 4 streets over. Ori reported similar residue near the East River tunnels. The stuff was spreading, not fast, not visible, but steady, like a thought whispering its way through the city's infrastructure. Kramer called around noon, his patience already in tatters. You told me it was neutralized, he barked. It was, Wolfe said, until it wasn't. I've got city officials breathing down my neck, reporters smelling a scandal, and you telling me New York's got a thinking germ crawling through its pipes. What do you expect me to do, Wolfe? Evacuate Manhattan? If necessary, Wolfe said simply. Kramer swore long enough to fill a dictionary, then hung up. By evening, Wolfe had mapped every recorded incident of the odor or residue across the boroughs. The pattern formed a spiral, tightening inward, converging toward a single point, the old confectionery plant where Maison du Cacao had first started. Of course, Wolfe said, almost to himself. Back to the source, like all children returning to their birthplace. He looked at me. We go there. I stared at him. We. Both of us, he said. I will not delegate this. Not this time. It took 2 hours to get him into the car. He sat stiffly in the back seat, silent except for the occasional grunt as the city passed in streaks of gray and light. When we reached the abandoned plant, the gates hung open, rust flaking like old paint. The sign, faded but legible, still read Maison du Cacao. Inside, the air was thick with humidity and something worse, the unmistakable sweetness of chocolate gone sour. Wolfe stopped just inside the doorway, scanning the room. "Do you hear that?" I did. A faint hum, low and rhythmic, coming from the vats that had once mixed Celia's creations. The metal gleamed faintly, as though breathing. He stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, and placed his hand on the nearest vat. For a moment, nothing. Then the surface rippled under his palm. "It recognizes stimulus," he said. "Perhaps even intelligence." "Magnificent." "Magnificent," I snapped. "It's about to eat the city." He ignored me. Celia Lamont built this to be perfect, but perfection without conscience is chaos. It has no will except survival, and survival, Archie, is the most ruthless logic of all. The hum deepened. The air shimmered. A thin mist began to rise from the vats, swirling around us like breath. Wolfe didn't move. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "Archie," he said, "the truffle." I reached into my coat and pulled out the last fragment of the stabilized sample we'd kept. Sealed in glass, inert since the night he'd neutralized the city. He took it carefully, his thick fingers steady. "This," he said, "is order, and that," he nodded at the pulsing vats, "is ambition. One must consume the other." Before I could stop him, he hurled the vial into the nearest vat. The reaction was instant. Light, heat, and a sound like 1,000 sighs. The mist exploded outward, then collapsed inward, drawn back into the metal like a breath reversed. For a second, the world seemed to hold still. Then silence. When my vision cleared, the vats were motionless. The hum was gone. Only the faint scent of burnt sugar lingered. Wolfe leaned heavily against the wall, pale but composed. "It's done," he said. We left without speaking. Outside, dawn was breaking, a thin ribbon of gold over the skyline. In the car, Wolfe finally exhaled. "Archie," he said quietly, "do you know why I stayed, why I insisted upon it?" "I'm guessing it wasn't for the exercise." He smiled faintly. "Because this was not a case of crime. It was a case of creation, and creation, once begun, must be witnessed to its end." Back at the brownstone, he went straight to his chair, sat heavily, and closed his eyes. "No interviews, no reports," he said. "Let the world believe it was merely fire and error. Truth is too fine a chocolate, it melts in untrained hands." I didn't argue. Some truths aren't meant to be written down. Later, when Fritz brought in breakfast, Wolfe looked at the tray and frowned. "No cocoa," he said. "Of course not, sir," Fritz replied softly. "Good," Wolfe murmured. "Let that be the final mercy." And as the city stirred awake beyond the windows, the smell of coffee and rain filling the room, I realized that once again, Wolfe had beaten chaos, by intellect, by will, and, in his own quiet way, by faith in the flaw that keeps humanity human. It was 3 days after the fire at Maison du Cacao when the last ember of the affair finally cooled. The newspapers called it an industrial accident, of course. They always do when the truth is too complicated for breakfast reading. The official story was that a chemical storage leak had caused a short circuit, igniting the abandoned plant. 2 night guards were treated for smoke inhalation. That was that. No mention of adaptive compounds, self-learning toxins, or the detective who spent one night out of his chair to save the city. Wolfe didn't contradict the headlines. He read them with a grunt, set the paper down, and returned to his orchids as though nothing had ever happened. That was his way of filing things. Silently, permanently. But the truth sat in the brownstone like an aftertaste, faint but unmistakable. By the 4th day, Fritz had restored the menu to normal, if you can call anything in that kitchen normal, and I was catching up on neglected correspondence when the doorbell rang again. For a second, I thought it might be trouble, but it wasn't trouble's hour. It was Kramer's. He came in without preamble, without cigar, and without the usual complaints about Wolfe's manners. That alone was enough to make me cautious. "Wolfe," he said, dropping his hat on the rack, "I'm not here for questions. I'm here because the commissioner thinks I should thank you." "I decline," Wolfe said without looking up from his book. "Gratitude, like sympathy, is useless after the fact." Kramer snorted. "That's about what I told him you'd say. Still, whatever the hell really happened in that factory, I don't want to know. The city's quiet, the air's clean, and my men can breathe again. I'll take that as a win." "As you should," Wolfe murmured. Kramer looked at him a moment longer, then at me. "You two are a pair of damn enigmas. One of these days, I'll get the truth out of you." He left it there, which was just as well. Wolfe watched the door close, then said softly, "He'll live longer not knowing." I sat across from him. "So that's it? We burn the devil and pretend it never existed?" "Not pretend," he said, lifting his glass of beer. "We remember, privately. The world is not improved by knowing every horror it spawns." He took a long sip, set the glass down, and regarded me. "Archie, has it occurred to you that we have encountered something extraordinary? Celia Lamont, in her obsession with perfection, stumbled into creation. Uncontrolled, yes, but undeniably creative. Her ambition breached nature itself. That is why it had to die." I nodded. "Yeah, though it seems a rough kind of justice." "Justice," Wolfe said, "is a convenience men invented to feel comfortable with consequence. What we delivered was necessity." He leaned back, folding his hands across his middle. "And necessity has no taste for sweetness." The room fell quiet after that. Fritz brought in coffee, and Wolfe took his cup without a word. The morning light angled through the blinds, striping the walls in golden shadow. For the first time in weeks, the brownstone felt balanced again, its silence restored, its order intact. Still, something in me resisted the calm. Maybe it was habit, maybe just curiosity. "Wolfe," I said finally, "that thing you said back in the lab, about intelligence not willingly dying, you think it's really gone?" He looked up from his coffee, the faintest glint of something, amusement maybe, or weariness in his eyes. "Archie, nothing intelligent truly dies. It merely changes form." "Comforting," I said dryly. "You planning to patent that?" He closed his eyes, unimpressed. If I were inclined to vulgarity. That ended it. I let the silence stand, and Wolfe let it breathe. Outside, the city moved on in its usual rhythm, impatient, noisy, alive. Inside, the orchids hummed under their lights. Fritz began the quiet ballet of dinner preparations, and Nero Wolfe, master of logic, appetite, and the delicate war between order and chaos, reached for his book. He didn't look up when he spoke again, but the words carried through the stillness, deliberate and final. "Archie, remind me," he said, "to never again involve myself with confectionery. It tempts the senses, clouds the mind, and kills with subtlety." I couldn't help smiling. "Sure, boss. I'll put it right next to your rule about leaving the house." "Do," he murmured. "Though one of those I might break again." That was as close as Wolfe ever came to sentiment. And as I sat there, watching the smoke from his cigar drift lazily toward the ceiling, I realized what he meant. The case wasn't just about chocolate or death or even genius. It was about control and the price of losing it. Outside, the city kept breathing, unaware of how close it had come to stopping. Inside, the brownstone returned to its quiet kingdom of order. Dinner was served, as always. And Nero Wolfe, as always, was right. Because in the end, it wasn't murder that threatened us most. It was perfection. And that, I figured, was as close to sweetness as the world would ever deserve, 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 ever deserve.